Good day, everyone. Sorry for the mute start. So welcome, lovely to have you with us for this discussion about Ready for the Drawdown, Community Early Warning of Atrocity Risks in MONUSCO. My name is Cedric de Kooning. I'm a research professor with the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. And I'm joined by Fred Carver of Protection Approaches and Giovanna Kuele of Igarape Institute. This is a meeting that is co-hosted, or a webinar that's co-hosted by Protection Approaches and the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. I should mention that this meeting is being recorded, so it's on the record. You are most welcome to engage with us through the Q&A function. Fred's going to introduce the report we are launching today in a few minutes. Giovanna will then comment on the report, and then we'll open up for discussion. So the report that Fred's going to introduce in a moment is entitled Linked Up Peacekeeping. It's funded through a Joe Cox Memorial Grant. And as the title of this webinar also explains, this is a report that focuses in on community early warning in the context of atrocity risks in MONUSCO. And as we all know, in the UN mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, protection of civilians has really been founded, in a sense, through policy, through mandating and policy and practice. And a lot of what we are practicing in protection of civilians elsewhere in Central African Republic, in Mali, in South Sudan, has in a sense been originated and experimented and developed in the context of the UN mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And despite the fact that that mission has been there for a long time, two decades now, the challenges with protection, of course, has not disappeared. Although a lot of innovation has taken place, and Fred's going to talk about the focus on community engagement and people-centered peacekeeping, the risk remains, and as recent flare-ups and in the North Kivus and the East has shown again, this risk and the need for protection of civilians remains with us. So it'll be very interesting in the context of the drawdown to hear from Fred what his report is focusing on. As you may know, I'm also coordinating the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network. We have also produced a study on the DRC, on MONUSCO, as well as last year, a study focusing specifically on the transition. So some of the aspects that Fred's going to touch on in terms of the larger strategic context of the transition, that's also something you could look at, and I'll maybe post that in the chat in a minute. But first, very keen to hear about the report that Fred's going to launch now. It's also going live as we speak during this webinar, and we'll post in the chat function the link to the report as well. So Fred, over to you.
Thank you so much, Cedric. Yes, as Cedric says, this is hot off the press. It's going live imminently. So apologies you don't have it with you now, but let me just explain a little bit what's in it. Let me start with a number of thanks. First of all, thank you to Protection Approaches for hiring me to write this report, which is something I've wanted to do for many, many years, and to Detmer in particular, also to Kate, for overseeing the work, for producing the report, and for co-hosting and co-arranging this event. I'm very, very grateful. And likewise to our other hosts, Cedric, Nupi, and Epon, for their productive partnership and for the inspiration that their work has provided, and to Cedric personally for the comments he provided on the paper. Thank you, Giovanna, for joining us, and also for your support over the years and our conversations on this subject, which have definitely strengthened and enriched this paper. And to the academic community in general on whose shoulders this report rests. And I really would be remiss if I didn't mention some particularly important contributions which this report builds on. Kathleen Jennings' work on the peace kept, and she also actually commented on this draft, which is very helpful. The amazing work Civic have done, both on community engagement and on MONUSCO, and indeed on the intersection of community engagement and MONUSCO. And work that was done on precisely this question about a decade or so ago by Charlie Hunt, who also was very helpful in the production of this report, by Halle Henningsen, and by Janusz Kullenberg. And then also to mention the report that came out last week from Lotte Vermeer's UN Peacekeeping Operations at a Crossroads. This is the EPOM magnum opus on protection of civilians across all UN peacekeeping operations, and it's got a wonderful MONUSCO section. And finally, I did want to thank MONUSCO. MONUSCO weren't able to participate in this research, which is a great shame, but I still want to thank them because staff at MONUSCO did bend over backwards to try to facilitate this research in every way that's possible. And in the end, we were undone by bureaucracy. And there have been new protocols brought in for understandable reasons. But the problem you have when you introduce bureaucratic mechanisms is it creates bureaucratic problems. And as a result, it was unfortunate that we weren't able to speak directly with MONUSCO. But MONUSCO have always been a very kind host to me on previous field research, including when I was there in 2018, which is where the germ of this idea was born, and have tried to be as open as protocols allow. So I am grateful for that. So to go through this paper, it does two things, I think. It fills in a fairly precise technical niche, but in so doing, it hopefully creates a pathway for some pretty big and actually in some senses quite broad ideas. So the precise niche is, it builds on the report that Kate Ferguson and Alex Buskey wrote last year, linked up and linked in, which is about how atrocity prevention attempts in the DRC could be improved by strengthening the interconnectivity between local, national, and international actors. And this in turn is part of a broader effort that Protection Approach is in the lead of, but a number of practitioners are involved with, which is to take a networking approach to improving the resilience of communities and the robustness of responses to atrocity risks. In other words, to prevent atrocities through strengthening interlinkages between actors. This report looks at one specific but important linkage within that network, which is the one between the people that Kathleen Jennings calls the peace kept, the populations at risk of atrocities, and the UN peacekeeping mission in the DRC, MONUSCO. And it looks at what the nature of that linkage is when it comes to atrocity prevention work. So what information is conveyed, what actions are initiated, and in what direction the communication occurs, and who owns the link. Now, the big ideas that this relates to explain that, I need to take a step back a bit and look at peacekeeping and what I feel this idea of people-centered peacekeeping, which EPON have iterated over the years, means to me. In very broad strokes, and apologies that this is going to be quite glib, particularly if you're a peacekeeping specialist, but we don't have long, and we will be on YouTube later. MONUSCO is probably the archetype of a particular style of peacekeeping that you could call the third generational stabilization missions. And on the one hand, this is a style that's going out of fashion. There hasn't been a new one in nearly a decade, and there's been lots of criticism of it as being expensive, as being dangerous, as breeding dependencies. On the other hand, no one has really come up with a better idea for dealing with situations of extreme fragility. And it's clear that for all this style of peacekeeping's issues, the one area in which its record is both fairly decent and improving is in preventing atrocities. So that gives us an immediate challenge and a long-term question. The immediate challenge is that as these missions are drawn down, as there becomes an increasingly hostile political climate to them and they lose political backing, how is that ability to prevent atrocities maintained, since that ability is clearly still needed? And then the long-term question is, what does the future of peacekeeping look like? and how, if it is a radically different model to the model that MONUSCO uses, is it still going to manage to serve that role of preventing atrocities? And I think the idea of people-centered peacekeeping, which has been championed by EPON and other academics for some years now, can play a major role in both respects. So one of the biggest challenges missions like MONUSCO face is this question of how you reconcile being there as a guest of the state and in partnership with the state, with the fact that the state is at best a flawed institution whose limitations you are there to supplement, and at worst, the perpetrator of the very atrocities you're seeking to prevent. And people-centered peacekeeping help there because it reconceptualizes the mission's client as being the local community and not the state itself. And in so doing, it can also change the nature of the UN's presence and then the terms on which it can leave. Because if you're working with the community, and not necessarily, but by no means excluding the state, on building these robust and resilient mechanisms, then you can find ways of engaging with communities that are empowering rather than creating dependencies. And you don't need to wait, because you might be waiting forever, for the state to reform itself to the point where it can provide the functions themselves, because you're empowering the community to provide for its own security. Now, let's be clear, that's a very ambitious and maximalist idea of what people-centered peacekeeping is and what it can achieve. And that's not really the way the term is used currently in the UN. It doesn't fit within the state-centric thinking of UN peacekeeping currently. But firstly, I do think it's a point worth making because frankly it should. But also, you don't need to fully reconceptualize peacekeeping and who peacekeeping's client is before you start to see the benefits of greater community engagement. Every little helps. And in terms of the little that helps, what MONUSCO has currently are these 3, give or take, mechanisms for community engagement. And my paper interrogates those mechanisms. So you have local protection councils, which are a forum for in-person conversations between the mission and the community. You have community alert networks, which are sort of social network for communication between focal points across the DRC and the mission. And you have community liaison assistants, who are a cohort of mission staff who play this absolutely vital bridge building role between the mission and wider society. In terms of that interrogation, what I found was typical of what one finds when one looks at peacekeeping, which is there's not one thing, there's a multitude of interconnecting factors, some of them quite subtle, which together add up to something which is highly imperfect, but which nevertheless does function and provides a lifeline by functioning. And so in the report, you'll find a table in which we go through these 3 mechanisms, how they work, how they interrelate, their strengths and weaknesses, etc. I just wanted to draw up 3 specific things. One is that these 3 approaches work well and work best when they're well-resourced and where they overlap, because the overlap allows the inherent weaknesses of each mechanism to counteract the others. They allow for a sort of the intermeshing is where they're strongest. And these mechanisms, in the grand scheme of things, are really very cheap. It's quite hard to work out precisely in terms of budget how much these mechanisms cost, but we're talking less, considerably less than 1% of the budget, which, considering how vital this is, one could argue central to the mission's functioning, is really nothing. And I think there is a problem with MONUSCO in that it does tend to try to make a virtue out of necessity. And it does claim, or it does give the impression that limited resources can be dealt with because we can take away without doing less. We can stretch mechanisms. We can allow mechanisms to be replaced by cheaper mechanisms without any loss of strength. And that's not really the case. The case is that actually you need multiple overlapping mechanisms. You need redundancy before you get the full benefit of these things. And the problem there is not just about performance, it's about a gap between expectations and performance, and the damage done by setting expectations too high. The second, and Civic are the real experts here, and here I'm largely just repeating their research, is these mechanisms have shallow roots. And right now, if MONUSCO draws down, they will fall over. and let's not pretend otherwise. There's also problems with the plan for their handover. The most worrying line in the UN's 2019 strategic review of MONUSCO is existing community alert networks and early warning systems should ultimately be entirely managed by state authorities. The level of trust, particularly in the Eastern DRC, between state authorities and local communities, that's not going to work. These have to be self-managing networks. They can't be state-run networks. They just won't work as state-run networks. So if these mechanisms are going to survive at all, then they're going to need to be nurtured for a while yet. And they're going to need to have much deeper roots grown, and there needs to be a plan put in place for them to become self-sustaining post-drawdown, and they need to be much more realistic about the role that the state can play in these mechanisms post-drawdown, which cannot be as owner, certainly not as sole owner. Finally, to say these mechanisms where they work do work pretty well. And also MONUSCO in places has really good analytic capacity. And also MONUSCO on occasions is capable of responding effectively. The issue is those three elements don't always gel. And so what is needed, and this is a recurring theme across a lot of protection approaches work, is the strengthening of the interconnectivity of analysis, response, and information. And it's not necessarily more resourcing, although I think when it comes to community engagement, more resourcing if available, which I know is never the case, would be appropriate. But it's about joining up and strengthening the ability of these elements to work together. Now, there's tools for that, such as that was called the JMAC, the Joint Mission Analysis Center. I think that's what that one stands for. But an important part of what's missing, to go back a bit, is conceptual. It's the idea of community engagement mechanisms, not just being this information harvesting tool, but to a certain extent, it's the mission's boss. It's the mechanism whereby the mission's clients, the people of the DRC, are able to task the mission. And that's the bit which I think reorders the network in a way which will be helpful. I'm about to stop, but I'm just going to say one last thing before I do, which is that we're in a period of particular uncertainty in the DRC now. There's tensions with Rwanda. We've seen the re-emergence of M23, potentially elections next year. So to answer the question of the title of the event, MONUSCO is not ready for the drawdown. And that's not MONUSCO's fault. That's because exit strategies involve the pulling of a number of levers, and MONUSCO only has access to some of those levers. And I think when you think about exit strategies for peacekeeping missions, particularly a mission like MONUSCO, and I'm mindful also of the report the Secretary General put out on peacekeeping transitions last week, I think we need to talk about exit criteria and not instill arbitrary timelines for drawing down, but only draw down when it's possible for that to occur without, the UN having to re-engage in 5 years' time after yet another cycle of crisis. I'll stop there, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Fred. You've touched on so many critical debates and critical issues. I mean, protection of civilians in and of itself is such an interesting topic, and the importance of the various community networks and mechanisms that you highlighted. I'm sure we'll come back to that. That's very interesting, and then the context of the drawdown in the Congo. And how some of those networks can be sustained, or if and how they should be sustained, and even the degree to which protection will or should remain a responsibility of the UN. I mean, if we compare with Darfur and with the Sudan mission, and if we think in those terms when it comes to drawdown, what the future role of the mission should be. One could imagine that if a indicator is protection of civilians at the level that the mission currently is expected to achieve, then can't imagine when drawdown would be possible. So I'm not sure if we can have both drawdown and an expectation that protection of civilians can continue at the same level that it is an expectation now of the responsibility of the mission. So that's very, very interesting, and we'll come back to that. But first, Giovanna, we're very interested to hear your comments on the report. So over to you.
Sure, thank you, Cedric. So first of all, I'm delighted to join this launch event. Thanks, Fred, and Protection Approaches. My own work focused during the past years on MONUSCO, where I did field work back in 2015. MONUSCO was my master thesis case study, and I couldn't agree more with both Cedric and Fred that DRC is a laboratory for different components of third generation missions, including community engagement approach, use of force, intelligence, and so on. But before I get into the paper itself and the future of peacekeeping, let me say a few words about the organization I'm currently with, the Igarapé Institute. So we've been working for the past 11 years in the area of international peace and security, and we started back there with UN peace operations and the role of Brazil. And we have expanded our mandate over the years. Today, our mission is also to contribute to public climate and digital security in Brazil and in the world, proposing solutions and partnerships for global challenge through research, new technologies, communications, and influence on public policies. And our peacekeeping DNA includes South-South cooperation, training civilians with the military, also support women peace and security, youth peace and security agenda, and so on. And also, we are part of the EPOL network, which is, and it was already mentioned here, but I want to say again, it's like an amazing and unique initiative led by Noop and Cedric, which brings and supports researchers from all over the world to do field work and produce innovative research on peace operations. So back to the paper, I have a few comments on issues I think are important to highlight. So first, I completely agree with the people-centered peacekeeping approach, and that there are mechanisms for deeper engagement with local communities. The challenge is to map, which Fred did an excellent job in this report to start, and evaluate if and how that translates into people-centered peacekeeping. Second, this paper shows the importance of early warning mechanisms, ones that include the local population. So there is already a myriad of initiatives out there. The issues are the lack of assessment and how to scale up what works. Third, the challenges of information gathering and verified data, which relate to the intelligence cycle, which is something I dedicated a couple of years to study. When I was in DRC in 2015, human intelligence was the main source of information, including from the CLAs. Of course, there are moral, political, and practical limitations for the UN when it comes to intelligence, but I think much more can be done, including the use of technologies. Even if MONUSCO was the first UN mission to use drones, capacity was limited. Fourth, the lack of trust in so many levels. I will mention two. First, between local population and the military. As Fred mentions, people were more reluctant to engage with CLAs when they are embedded with the military, which is usually the case in most critical areas. When I was there, the engagement with the local population was complicated. On one hand, for example, in Goma, you have people, local people, who depend on the mission to survive, and they're very grateful to it, as it creates what we call the peacekeeping economy around it. So in a withdrawal plan, that's also important to consider. On the other hand, there is lots of mistrust, also related to the use of force. For example, humanitarian NGOs wouldn't want to be seen with MONUSCO military. And also the issues between civilian and military within the mission. In the paper, Fred mentions JMAC, and he mentioned a bit here, as what could solve the duplication in theory and the need for more research on it. I agree, and I think we are far away from having the JMAC as that because of mistrust. For example, when I was there in 2015, I had a hard time to interview people who worked at JMAC because I had been invited to be there by the military component of the mission. Fifth, the budgetary issues, as Fred raised. Some of the mechanisms not even had a line in the latest MONUSCO budget. So we say all the time we need to invest in prevention and the local people, but there is a clear gap between what is needed and what happens between the field and New York headquarters. And finally, as Fred mentions, what happens when the missions withdraw? Some of these mechanisms, some will likely survive, others won't. So what is the plan? What happens to the people and the economy that rely on the mission? I think perhaps no country more than DRC knows the story of the UN pulling in and out, which speaks to the future of peacekeeping. I think in general, it seems the era of large peacekeeping, not only in terms of personnel, but also number of tasks, is over, which is very curious if we consider that we're also witnessing a spike in conflict since 2014, when the latest big mission was created. So very briefly, 2 points, one about the future of the Security Council and the other about how we address global threats. So first, I think it's important to say that even with the repeated failures of the Security Council to prevent conflict and atrocities, we always still turn to the Security Council when a conflict emerges, and we expect, or at least discuss, the possibility of a peacekeeping mission as the answer. So the UN is still the geopolitical stage and the clearinghouse for peace and security matters through the Security Council, despite all the criticism. And today, the global challenges such as climate change, food security, nuclear proliferation, pandemics, new technologies, and so on, they are all interconnected, and they create new stressors and uncertainty in ending wars. For some of these, such as climate and pandemic, it is debatable if the Security Council is the place to deal with that and how peacekeeping should incorporate them. But as Fred wrote, the obituary of UN peacekeeping has been written so many times in the past. So I think the question is more about how peacekeeping should and will look like in the future than if it will continue to exist. I'm looking forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giovanna, and also for bringing in the discussion on the future of peacekeeping and how that relates to the broader development of peacekeeping in this context. To our participants, please engage with Fred and Giovanna and join the debate through the Q&A function or the chat function. I see we have a number of people in the group who are really experienced and have a lot of knowledge on the DRC and on protection and on peacekeeping. So please, you are most welcome. We would really love to hear from you. Maybe I can kick us off with a question, perhaps to both of you, and that is that for me, one of the major problems with protection and the future of peacekeeping, in a sense, is exemplified by the fact that up to now we've been talking about the UN when we talk about protection of civilians in the DRC, and so the mere fact that we have a large peacekeeping operation means that the oxygen in the room, the policy space, the discussion gets taken up by, you know, how should the peacekeeping operation function and so on. But what about the people in the DRC? What about the politics? What about the causes of the protection? What about the drivers of conflict? If you ignore the UN, which is at the end of the day, even although it's a large mission, a very small dimension in the larger conflict system or society and drivers of what's happening in the DRC and what will happen in the DRC when the UN mission withdraws. I think even today, the UN probably has a relatively small influence in the overall system that drives the Congo, and that won't change. So, you know, isn't it a good idea, or isn't it a positive development that we're moving away from these large peacekeeping operations? Because then perhaps we'll stop talking so much about the UN missions and more about the actual conflict drivers, the people involved, and what to do about them. And maybe the accountability, we won't be talking about, you know, whenever there's a atrocity, you know, we're talking about keeping the UN responsible for not preventing that atrocity, as opposed to talking about why that atrocity happened in the first place, who the perpetrators are, and how, and you know, putting in place local mechanisms to prevent that, etc. So isn't it precisely the problem that we are so fixated on UN and UN peacekeeping when dealing with these conflicts, when perhaps the solution is precisely to deal with the situation as it is without the UN peacekeeping as like the main factor we all focused on? So love to hear your comments on that, and let's go to Fred first and then Giovanna.
Thank you for that. I mean, Broadly, yes, but the issue is the human cost in the meantime. I mean, I think it's true, and the DRC is a very obvious example of this. We've also seen, you know, Darfur as a clear example that this idea that's like you sit on the boiling pot to stop the lid exploding is not a long-term solution, and then you remove the mission and nothing's changed, and the crises are still there, and you still have you know, atrocities occurring as you did in Darfur with the withdrawal of UNAMID. That said, just allowing the pot to boil is not an option either. And certainly if you look at, for example, the Central African Republic circa 2013-14, you know, had MONUSCO not been there, we would have had an outright genocide. And so the question is then, is you're right, it does suck the oxygen out of the room. It doesn't solve the long-term problem. It doesn't create robust and resilient communities. But if you just pull the mission out, and given where we're starting from, then you have sort of atrocities occur immediately. So this is where I think people-centered peacekeeping can square the circle, because you need to build resilient and robust communities with the mission in post, preventing violence. And that's the idea about sort of changing this idea of who peacekeeping is for and who owns peacekeeping to be more enabling of communities rather than the state. This idea of the peace building has been sort of strengthening the state capacity. I think the problem is that the state, frankly, has, certainly in security sense, too much capacity. The UN mission needs to live alongside and facilitate and enable, and where necessary, get out of the way of the building of resilient communities, regardless of the state, in parallel to the state. And I think future peacekeeping missions might see a much smaller UN footprint, a much smaller force, and much more investment in this kind of networking work. And I think in other places, what you'll see is many other actors, particularly regional actors, in the picture. There are specific reasons why I think that doesn't work in DRC. I mean, frankly, the regional actors are part of the problem. And so there is a need for the sort of neutral arbiter like the UN, I think, in that case. But yes, I don't think it's necessarily about the fact that it's a good thing if the UN, certainly it's not a good thing if the UN vanishes overnight, but the UN has to be seen as an interim fix while long-term solutions are put in place, rather than being the long-term solution. The UN also needs to change the way it operates so it can develop and enable that long-term solution. That was a bit of a round.
No, thanks so much, Fred. And as we go to Giovanna, just want to point out Leah Mahoney, I think, into a good question in the chat as well, that links very well with your point as well, that, you know, to what degree in this changing nature of peacekeeping, no big new missions, all the new missions that have come up, special political missions, as we see in Sudan, as for example, to what degree, Giovanna, also if you can start to answer that, you know, do we have experiences about unarmed and or civilian missions providing protection? I see one of the colleagues we have and the participants is Gay Rosenblum-Kumar. I hope Gay comes in as well, but we have the whole issue around civilian protection and accompaniment. So that'll be a very interesting, I think, topic that will come more to the fore as peacekeeping perhaps moves towards more smaller special political missions, unarmed missions, and so forth. Giovanna, your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, peacekeeping started unarmed. So, and we've been had these discussions within the peacekeeping community where, like, what's the way of peacekeeping to go? Is it something different? Is it going back to the past? But when it comes to DRC and the issue about the UN, I think if there is one place that it's impossible to ignore the UN presence, because it has been for such a long time, it's DRC. So there is a large footprint. For example, with the mission like shutting down and withdrawing, I know there are already some camps of former combatants that were already shut down. So what happens to the people who were there? You know, they need protection and so on. So I think like the situation now might create a vacuum if there is not a good transition plan, which could also be a way of thinking about what is the new type of peacekeeping mission we want to see. Because I think in DRC, like the presence of the UN is, you know, it has been for such a long time, all the economy around it. So it's impossible just to pull out and ignore the UN presence there.
Thank you so much. And I see Gay has also posted in the chat about unarmed civilian peacekeeping and the experiences of the non-violent peace force in South Sudan and Sudan. And I wonder, as he also mentions there in the context of unarmed civilian protection, whether this is something which UN missions could or should start doing in the future, or is that best done by NGOs and others? I mean, we've had, let's say, humanitarian agencies like UNHCR and humanitarian NGOs, of course, always involved in providing protection as well for the communities or the displaced persons that they protect without armed force. So, I mean, the provision of protection without necessary military forces has been something that has been going on, and something which perhaps we need to look at more in the future as well in the peacekeeping context. I think the one dilemma with the stabilization operations we have in the DRC and elsewhere is that the more we do prevent atrocities and stabilize to the extent that these missions do, the less incentive there is for the political elites to make the compromises necessary to bring settlement, right? So that is why we end up 20 years later with the situation more or less unchanged, because the peacekeeping operation has actually helped to maintain the status quo and prevented the situation from being resolved in one or other fashion, because it has interrupted this feedback loops that come through conflict. Not that we want to give the pot to boil over, not that we want to give conflict-free range, but we do need to take into account that the kind of stabilization operations we have, in a sense, perpetuate conflict, although they at the same time prevent mass atrocities and large-scale armed conflict. They do at the same time somehow play a role in these conflicts not settling, the way we have seen with the type of peacekeeping operations where there has been a peace agreement and then subsequently an implementation of the peace agreement. So I do think that is a dimension and that is partly why I think we see this shift in peacekeeping away from the large peacekeeping operations, because the Security Council and others have picked up on this and want to try something new, are frustrated with the poor performance of these operations, and especially by their, let's say, their reputational loss through sexual exploitation, abuse, of protection failures, and so on. So that expectation we've raised with protection is partly its responsibility for the failure. So the one concern I have with your overall findings, Fred, is that, you know, if that is the reason why we're moving away from large-scale peacekeeping, the idea that we can somehow maintain that level of protection, even when we move into something completely new, I think is unrealistic. I think the move to something different in the peacekeeping context will come at the same time with the loss of that role of protection that the UN has played, and others will have to find other ways of performing that protection. So that'll be very interesting. I see we also have another comment from Gay saying UN entities can use unarmed approaches and undertake certain methods of unarmed civilian protection, as civil affairs already does in peacekeeping operation. But unarmed civilian protection really needs to be undertaken by civil society members in complement to international actors. So I think that's a good point, that combination, as we see also currently in Sudan, in Sudan, you know, that combination of the role that the UN mission have, because its reporting goes to the Security Council and so forth, but they may not necessarily have the resources to deploy into the ground and to maintain these networks that we have seen in the DRC. That will probably have to fall to other actors. Any further comments, Fred, Giovanna, also on the points that Liam and Gay posed in the chat?
Yeah, if I could just come in on a few things there. I think that was a really rich discussion, actually. I just want to unpack it a little bit. So first of all, I think this is an area where we see that there is a trade-off at times between what we call a conflict prevention approach and an atrocity prevention approach. I think there are times where what is needed to prevent atrocities is not in the interests of long-term peace building. But I think we've also got to consider, you know, at what price peace. I think it's sometimes the case that building a lasting and sustainable peace needs to take a little bit longer in the interests of making sure that we get there without atrocities having occurred. And I think there is a case, therefore, for a protection mandate. I think you're totally right, Cedric, that if we move away from these large force-based missions, they won't be able to perform the protection of civilians' roles. And I think the UN needs to be honest about its expectation management there. And it needs to say that if it's doing things in a different way, it will have different outcomes. And communities need to therefore consider their own security differently. That said, I'd still make the case, I don't want to give up entirely on this element of the third generation missions, because I think they do perform an important role. I think where global politics is at the moment, and has been for some time post-war on terror, is that there is no appetite at all politically for non-state armed groups to be empowered. And one of the key things that all kind of state-based UN approaches do is they disarm local actors, etc. That means there's no self-protection ability. And because there's no self-protection ability, if we're talking about what the community wants, quite often what the community requests from the mission is a military response to military actors, whether it's, you know, a threat from an ethnic group or simply just banditry. There's this need, there's this request that's made for protection. I don't think that can be entirely ignored. That said, I just have to be realistic, I think, about the fact that that kind of UN peacekeeping is going out of fashion. And I think one of the things I was so interested to work with protection approaches on this project, one of the reasons why I was so interested to work with protection approaches on this project, is because what protection approaches have been looking at is, in the context of responsibility to protect, with the idea of humanitarian intervention being totally dead politically, how can we enforce the responsibility to protect in a non-military way? And what Kate Ferguson and others have been looking at is this idea of increasing resilience and robustness through networking. And I think that is deeply applicable to the UN, and that's what this paper tries to do. We just need to be honest that the expectations of robust and resilient communities who are better networked are not overnight going to offer the same protective function as 25,000 soldiers. I hope that's self-evident. And then the final thing, just to reply to Guy, I end this paper with a list of research questions I would love to be tackled. And I think this idea of nonviolent peacekeepers is absolutely something that could be on that list, and something that I'd be interested to read more of your research on, and also that I think there should be more research on. My instinct, and at this level it's just an instinct, is if something can be done by a non-UN actor, it's better done by a non-UN actor, because the UN does bring unrivaled legitimacy in some senses, and that's useful when it comes to, for example, the use of force. But in other senses, it's so constrained that if a civil society actor can do it, it's probably better that a civil society actor do it. I'll stop there. I've seen Liam put something in the chat, so I'll just stop and read it. But do come back to me if you wish.
Thanks, Fred. Yes, I actually wanted to just pose Liam's question to you as well before I go to Giovanna, because it's specifically aimed at or directed at you. And Liam was saying that his question was more specific and limited to your point, and asking, do you think these three mechanisms, the community network and liaison assistance and the councils, could function if they were funded and had a structure, but did not have armed peacekeepers nearby? I mean, how much is the function of the CLAs, for instance, focused only on, alerting peacekeepers for a response? And I think that's a very interesting point, because one problem that I do think with the networks that have been established for protection of civilians and peacekeeping is that ultimately they are there to serve the peacekeeping mandate. If left to their own, the communities would not necessarily have come up with those structures. And therefore, when MONUSCO withdraws, I'm not sure that those networks would function and continue to function in the same way that they do now if they were to serve themselves as opposed to the peacekeeping mission. So I think that's a very important question that Liam poses. So if you can respond to that, and then we'll go to Giovanna.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a yes, but so to go through them one by one, when it comes to local protection councils, if you look at Beni, for example, the community did organize local protection councils themselves. And in fact, they're rather more deeply rooted as a consequence than the ones that were set up by MONUSCO. So I think it is possible. I think you've just got to consider the risk to someone joining a local protection council in a situation of likely atrocity with no large armed peacekeeping force nearby. And you've also got to consider, and this is where I think the mechanisms that MONUSCO has set up do tend to wither when MONUSCO withdraw from the area, that the point for a local community in participating in these missions, which does come with a time cost, but also just significant increased risks, is that you are going to get a robust response for doing so. And if so that robust response is not forthcoming, then it changes the equation as to whether or not it's worth doing. So I think it does need to be linked to an effective response mechanism. And I think this then go back to the other question is what does, and this is what Linked Up and LinkedIn talks about, is what does an effective atrocity risk response mechanism that doesn't involve a large military force look like? And I think the answer is it's possible, and there's a lot that can be done, but it's a slower burner. And in the situation of immediate risk, you do want that large military force there. Community alert networks absolutely can and have been set up in the absence of a large military force. Again, you've got to consider the equation is different if all you get is an alert, you don't get a reaction from the nearby base, but it is still a useful mechanism for communities to inform each other of enhanced risks, and so they absolutely can. Community liaison assistance, as it currently stands, security protocols mean that it's very, very difficult for them to operate in areas of risk outside of the, in fact, where it's a red area of risk, they can't operate outside of a temporary military base. I mean, there's a really, really big question here, which there's been some research on, and I think it's something that needs further consideration, is where does risk lie and where do we outsource risk? Because it would be entirely unfair to tell community liaison assistants that they need to expose themselves to greater risks for the greater good of peacekeeping. At the same time, if you don't have that liaison function, then what you're really doing is you're outsourcing risk to the Congolese community themselves, and they're the ones that have to take the risk to communicate to the mission. So there's a question of where risk lies, and where in mitigating risk, which post-cruise report we're obviously very aware that there's a need for the UN to do, are we just outsourcing risk onto the local actors? And that there's a very nuanced question. I don't think I'm sitting in this very comfy chair here should say what level of risk community liaison assistance should be exposed to. That doesn't feel fair, but it is something that needs to be seriously considered. But community liaison assistance, where there is the security situation to support them, could absolutely operate, do absolutely do good work on peace building without a major military presence there. But at the moment in MONUSCO, that's a tiny minority because of the security situation and where they're mostly deployed.
Fred, let me, thanks so much. I want to go over to Giovanna because we've got 10 minutes left and I would like to hear from her as well. Giovanna, one thing I just want to add to your list is, I mean, MONUSCO has been drawing down and has been shrinking. So obviously we must have some experience of places where MONUSCO had a presence before and no longer has a presence. And so do we have examples from those areas in terms of whether these networks have continued, or what the situation has been after the mission is withdrawn from those areas? So over to you, Giovanna.
Thanks, Cedric. So I'm going to be very brief because I saw there is also one more question related to peace building for Fred in the chat box. I just want to emphasize that the issue about non-UN actors, I think we should be looking more at these mechanisms outside the UN, Someone mentioned in the chat box the non-violent peace forces. There is Peace Brigade International, SWIFT 4, and so on. And I'm not sure I understood your question about, it's about examples of places where the mission withdraw, but the mechanism continue. Is it that?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any knowledge about that from your research, as MONUSCO has been drawing down and leaving some areas as the numbers have been reduced and budget have been shrinking. Surely we must have some experience of places where MONUSCO presence provided protection and where there was these new networks in place and where now MONUSCO no longer has a presence. So I was just wondering if we have some experiences from that. If you don't have touched on that in your research, maybe Fred, is that something Fred can come back to that later?
Yeah, I think Fred can come back later. From my experience, to be honest, the places I kept following up when the mission left, there was not like much that continued unless some humanitarian development NGO stepped in. Over to Fred.
Thank you very much, Fred. And you've probably seen the message from Gay as well, the last question. So if you can comment on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, and the civic research on this is very good. Right now, the mechanisms tend to fall over when MONUSCO withdraw. But I think that doesn't necessarily have to happen. I think those withdrawals were handled in specific ways which could have been done better. But that is, right now, the record is not good. When MONUSCO withdraw from an area, these mechanisms struggle. In terms of Guy's question, I actually think in some ways MONUSCO does this better than other parts of the UN. And I do want to pay some credit to MONUSCO because they really have, these are innovative mechanisms and they do work to a certain extent, and that is really very positive. And I'm not aware of other parts of the UN on the humanitarian side engaging in this way or making this great an attempt at community engagement. I think that actually this is a situation where the rest of the UN could learn from MONUSCO, particularly because when MONUSCO withdraws, the UN won't. There'll still be a sizable UN country team and presence in the DRC. That said, this research doesn't cover those questions. This research, it's so difficult, and I am always so tempted when writing about peacekeeping to pull threads, but you end up everywhere. And in order to guard against that, I've tried to quite specifically silo what this paper is about. And so I deliberately didn't look at, for example, UNDP in the DRC. Thanks.
I mean, one thought that just comes to my mind, coming from South Africa and thinking back of the National Peace Accord, that, I mean, what you probably ideally need in a situation like that is a national and local mechanism to replace, right, to transition to. And I don't know if there's enough investment. We tend to stick to the international. If it's not the peacekeeping mission, then it must be the country team. Or, why are we not investing in helping to develop national and local structures that can provide those same functions as we've seen in various places? And so I think that's really what, in a sense, what people-centered peacekeeping should transition towards. That'll be interesting to see. There's a very good book that's just coming out now on the history of the National Peace Accord in South Africa. We have about 5 minutes left. So perhaps I'll go to Fred and Giovanna just for some last closing thoughts from both of you before we close this discussion. Thank you so much for a very rich discussion so far. Let's go in reverse order. I'll give Giovanna opportunity first. Giovanna, any closing thoughts from you?
Oh, I just want to thank you. Thank you for sharing Fred and protection approaches. It was a very rich discussion, and I will let the content to Fred now.
Thanks so much, Giovanna. Thank you for coming in and providing, acting as a discussant and commenting on the report. It's been very good to hear from your research and from your perspective as well. And good luck for your future research as well. Fred.
Thank you so much. Look, Cedric, I think you summed it up really well just there. Where trust has broken down, where there is no social contract between the state and local communities, trust needs to be built and developed at levels below the state. And we need locally led mechanisms as well as state led mechanisms. And I think that's really, as you put it, like the key part of people-centered peacekeeping that appeals to me, that I've tried to bring through on this paper, is we can't have, in a situation where people are with good reason distrustful of, and in cases terrified of the state, the answer to everything being strengthening state processes. We need locally led, we need multi-layer, local, national and international, and there is no monolithic local and there's no monolithic community, but we need multi-layer, multipolar leadership of processes. And that's really the message of work protection approaches have been doing for some time, and that's really the message of the paper. So thank you for summing that up. I will tell you that the paper is ready to go and will be uploaded shortly. I think we're going to email you all that link imminently, or possibly my colleague Ditmo will be able to stick it in the chat. If so, that will happen more or less imminently. But just to reiterate, thank you all so much for joining, and I really appreciate your chairing, Cedric, and this partnership. And thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you to you and Giovanna for excellent presentations and for sharing the debate, sharing your research, and thank you for all our participants for staying with us and for engaging in the chat with very interesting questions. I think many of the people in the group in our audience are really experienced and have a lot of knowledge on this topic. So it was great to have your engagement with this research. Thank you very much. Thank you to Protection Approaches. It was a pleasure for NUPI to be involved in this event as well, and the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network. So we'll eagerly look to your future work in this area, both your work, Fred, and your work, Giovanna, but also Protection Approaches. So thank you very much, everyone. Then we bring this webinar to a close today. And I'm sure, as Fred said, Protection Approaches will follow up with you with the link to the report, and also later the link to where this webinar has been captured on YouTube. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.